Imagine kneeling in a dim medieval confessional, the heavy scent of incense suffocating your breath, while a shadowed priest leans forward to whisper that your soul is damned, not for murder, theft, or adultery, but for the unforgivable sin of eating meat on the wrong day, or for the mortal transgression of doubting whether bread truly transforms into flesh during communion. Imagine discovering that the church, that towering institution claiming to guide humanity toward salvation, had spent centuries meticulously crafting an intricate catalogue of sins so obscure, so impossible to avoid, that every human soul became a guaranteed customer in the marketplace of redemption. This is not the story of the familiar sins taught in Sunday schools, but the hidden architecture of spiritual terrorism, a systematic campaign to transform the most basic human impulses, thoughts, and actions into pathways to eternal damnation, ensuring that no person could live without the constant need for ecclesiastical forgiveness, absolution, and the expensive sacraments that filled church coffers while emptying believers' souls of hope. The medieval church did not merely preach against sin. It invented sins with the calculating precision of a master manipulator, weaving webs of guilt so complex and inescapable that salvation became not a gift of divine grace, but a product to be purchased through tithes, indulgences, and absolute submission to clerical authority. These were not theological accidents or natural developments of Christian doctrine, but deliberate constructions designed to maintain power, generate wealth, and ensure that no human being could ever feel secure in their relationship with God without the constant mediation of priests who held the keys to heaven and hell in their politically motivated hands. In the shadowed halls of monasteries and cathedral schools, theologians labored not to understand divine truth, but to manufacture spiritual dependencies, creating elaborate taxonomies of sin that transformed every aspect of human experience into potential damnation. From the food consumed to the thoughts entertained, from the clothes worn to the words spoken, from the emotions felt to the dreams experienced during sleep. The sin of curiositas stands as perhaps the most insidious example of manufactured transgression, a concept that criminalized the very human desire to understand the world beyond the narrow boundaries established by church doctrine. This was not merely a prohibition against dangerous knowledge, but a comprehensive assault on intellectual freedom that branded curiosity itself as a pathway to hell. Medieval theologians argued that excessive interest in natural phenomena, mathematics, medicine, or any field of study not explicitly sanctioned by religious authority constituted a form of spiritual pride that led souls away from proper submission to divine will. The boundaries of acceptable knowledge were deliberately kept vague and constantly shifting, ensuring that scholars, students, and even casual observers of nature lived in constant fear that their intellectual interests might condemn them to eternal torment. Farmers who studied weather patterns too closely, physicians who investigated human anatomy beyond prescribed limits, and philosophers who asked questions about the natural world, all found themselves branded with the sin of curiositas, their pursuit of understanding transformed into evidence of spiritual corruption. The Church wielded this manufactured sin as a weapon against any form of education or intellectual development that might challenge clerical monopoly on truth, creating a climate where ignorance became virtue and knowledge became sin. Even more twisted was the sin of acedia, originally understood as a spiritual listlessness that affected monks but gradually expanded into a catch-all condemnation that could be applied to virtually any form of emotional or physical state that did not demonstrate constant visible enthusiasm for religious activities. This sin evolved from a recognition of genuine spiritual struggle into a tool for policing every aspect of human emotional experience, condemning not only those who felt genuinely depressed or spiritually dry, but anyone who failed to display the exact level of religious fervor demanded by local authorities. Citizens were expected to demonstrate their spiritual health through prescribed behaviors: regular attendance at lengthy religious services, visible participation in community prayers, financial contributions to church projects, and emotional responses that conformed to clerical expectations. Those who appeared insufficiently enthusiastic, who missed services due to illness or work obligations, who could not afford the expected donations or who simply possessed naturally reserved temperaments found themselves accused of the sin of acedia. The accusation was particularly dangerous because it was impossible to disprove. Any defense against charges of spiritual listlessness could itself be interpreted as evidence of the sin, creating a logical trap that made innocence impossible to establish. The sin of gula was expanded far beyond simple gluttony into a comprehensive system for controlling every aspect of eating, drinking, and physical pleasure that transformed basic human needs into moral minefields. The Church developed elaborate taxonomies that distinguished between different types of food-related sins: eating too much, eating too little, eating too eagerly, eating too slowly, eating expensive foods, eating cheap foods, eating at the wrong times, eating the wrong combinations of ingredients, and countless other violations that made every meal a potential occasion for spiritual corruption. Fasting requirements were deliberately made complex and contradictory, with different rules for different seasons, different social classes, different regions, and different circumstances, ensuring that perfect compliance was virtually impossible while creating numerous opportunities for the Church to collect fines and demand penance from violators. Even the enjoyment of food became sinful. Taking pleasure in taste, texture, or satisfaction from eating was condemned as evidence of spiritual weakness and attachment to worldly pleasures. The poor faced particular persecution under these regulations, as their inability to afford prescribed foods during fasting periods, or their desperate consumption of whatever food was available during times of scarcity, could be branded as evidence of moral failing rather than economic necessity. The sin of superbia was perhaps the most politically motivated invention, designed to criminalize any form of self-respect, personal achievement, or resistance to authority that might threaten the established social order. While traditionally understood as excessive pride, the Church expanded this concept to include virtually any form of positive self-regard or independent thinking that did not explicitly defer to clerical and noble authority. Peasants who took pride in their work, merchants who celebrated their business success, scholars who confidence in their intellectual abilities, and women who demonstrated any form of self-assurance, all risked condemnation for the sin of pride. The definition was deliberately elastic, allowing authorities to brand as sinful any behavior or attitude that challenged existing power structures, while simultaneously demanding that people maintain enough self-worth to fulfill their social and religious obligations, a psychological impossibility that guaranteed constant feelings of inadequacy and spiritual failure. The accusation of pride could be leveled against anyone who questioned authority, who achieved success without proper deference to their social superiors, who displayed confidence in their own judgment, or who simply failed to demonstrate sufficient humility in their interactions with clergy and nobility. The sin of luxuria expanded far beyond sexual misconduct into a comprehensive condemnation of any form of physical comfort, aesthetic pleasure, or material enjoyment that created a climate where basic human needs became occasions for guilt and self-hatred. The Church developed intricate regulations governing not only sexual behavior, but also clothing, housing, decoration, music, art, and entertainment, creating a world where beauty itself became suspect and comfort became evidence of spiritual corruption. Citizens were expected to live in deliberate discomfort as proof of their spiritual dedication, wearing rough clothing, eating bland food, sleeping on hard surfaces, and avoiding any form of sensory pleasure that might distract from religious contemplation. The wealthy faced particular scrutiny, as their ability to afford luxuries made them constant targets for accusations of spiritual corruption, while the poor were simultaneously condemned for envying those luxuries and praised for their involuntary adherence to ascetic principles. The regulations governing dress were particularly vindictive, with elaborate rules specifying acceptable colors, fabrics, styles, and accessories for different social classes, seasons and occasions, creating a system where fashion became a moral minefield and personal expression became evidence of spiritual pride. The sin of ira was manipulated to criminalize not only anger, but any form of emotional response to injustice, oppression, or abuse that might motivate resistance to established authority. While genuine uncontrolled rage was indeed destructive, The Church expanded this concept to include righteous indignation at corruption, anger at social injustice, frustration with economic exploitation, and even disappointment with religious leaders who failed to live up to their proclaimed ideals. Citizens were expected to accept suffering, inequality, and abuse with perfect equanimity, viewing any emotional response to mistreatment as evidence of their own spiritual inadequacy rather than legitimate reaction to genuine wrongs. The poor were particularly targeted by this manufactured sin, as their natural anger at their circumstances could be branded as spiritual failing rather than recognized as reasonable response to systematic oppression. Even parents defending their children, workers protesting dangerous conditions, and victims of abuse expressing their pain could find themselves condemned for the sin of anger, creating a psychological framework that transformed justified emotional responses into occasions for guilt and self-condemnation. The sin of invidia was weaponized to prevent solidarity among the oppressed by criminalizing the natural human tendency to compare circumstances and desire improvement in social conditions. This manufactured sin went far beyond simple jealousy to encompass any form of dissatisfaction with social inequality, any desire for advancement beyond one's birth circumstances, and any recognition that others possessed advantages that were unfairly distributed. Peasants who envied nobles their wealth and leisure, servants who desired the freedom of their masters, and women who resented the privileges accorded to men, all found themselves condemned for the sin of envy, rather than recognized as victims of unjust social systems. The Church used this concept to maintain existing hierarchies by making the desire for equality itself a form of spiritual corruption, ensuring that those at the bottom of social structures would focus their energy on self-condemnation rather than social reform. The theology of envy was particularly twisted in its application to economic relationships, where workers who desired fair compensation for their labor, tenants who wanted secure housing, and citizens who sought political representation all risked condemnation for coveting what belonged to their social superiors. The sin of avaritia was selectively applied in ways that condemned the economic aspirations of ordinary people while exempting the wealth accumulation of church and nobility, creating a double standard that served political rather than spiritual purposes. Merchants were condemned for seeking profit, farmers for wanting to own their land, and craftsmen for charging fair prices for their work. While bishops accumulated vast fortunes, monasteries controlled huge estates, and noble families passed wealth through generations without spiritual consequence. The Church developed elaborate justifications for its own economic activities, while simultaneously preaching that material success was evidence of spiritual corruption, creating a system where economic advancement was available only to those who served ecclesiastical and noble interests. Citizens were taught to view their own desire for economic security as evidence of greed, while accepting the vast wealth of their spiritual and temporal leaders as evidence of divine favor, a logical contradiction that served to legitimize existing power structures while preventing economic mobility that might threaten established hierarchies. The invention of theological sins that had no basis in Scripture or early Christian tradition reveals the calculated nature of this spiritual manipulation. Concepts like the sin of curiositas appear nowhere in biblical texts, but were constructed by medieval theologians to serve specific political purposes, namely the suppression of intellectual inquiry that might challenge church authority. Similarly, the elaborate taxonomies of sexual sin that developed during the medieval period went far beyond biblical prohibitions to create comprehensive systems for controlling human sexuality in ways that served clerical and political interests rather than genuine spiritual growth. The Church manufactured sins related to specific forms of knowledge, particular types of emotional expression, and detailed aspects of daily life that had never been considered sinful in earlier Christian communities, demonstrating that these concepts were innovations designed to increase clerical power rather than authentic developments of Christian doctrine. The economic motivations behind sin invention become clear when examining the elaborate systems of penance, indulgence, and absolution that developed alongside these manufactured transgressions. Each newly invented sin created new opportunities for the church to extract payments from believers seeking forgiveness, with complex scales of penance that could be commuted to financial payments for those who could afford them. The poor were required to perform physical penances, fasting, pilgrimage, public humiliation, while the wealthy could purchase spiritual forgiveness through donations to church coffers, creating a two-tiered system of salvation that explicitly linked economic status to spiritual standing. The sale of indulgences became a massive revenue source for the church, with professional partners traveling throughout Europe, selling forgiveness for sins both committed and contemplated, transforming spiritual redemption into a commercial enterprise that generated enormous wealth for ecclesiastical institutions. The psychological warfare involved in sin invention created populations living in constant fear of damnation, dependent on clerical mediation for any sense of spiritual security, and unable to trust their own moral intuitions in the face of constantly shifting definitions of sinful behavior. Citizens were taught to doubt their own thoughts, feelings, and actions, viewing their natural human responses as potential evidence of spiritual corruption rather than normal aspects of human experience. This systematic undermining of personal moral confidence created populations that were easily manipulated by authorities who claimed exclusive access to divine truth and salvation, ensuring political compliance through spiritual terror. The church's manufactured sins served as tools of social control that were far more effective than physical coercion, as they operated internally within believers' minds, creating self-policing mechanisms that made external enforcement largely unnecessary. The targeting of women through specialized sin categories reveals the deeply political nature of these theological innovations. As female-specific sins were invented to justify social, economic, and political restrictions that served male clerical and noble interests rather than genuine spiritual purposes. Women faced condemnation for sins related to their appearance, their speech, their emotional expression, their intellectual interests, and their social relationships in ways that had no parallel in male-focused theological discourse, demonstrating that these concepts were tools of gender oppression rather than authentic spiritual guidance. The church developed elaborate theologies of female sinfulness that portrayed women as inherently more susceptible to spiritual corruption, requiring constant male supervision and clerical intervention to maintain their salvation, creating theological justifications for social systems that denied women autonomy, education, and economic independence. Female mystics and religious leaders who challenged clerical authority through claims of direct divine revelation found themselves condemned for the sin of pride or accused of demonic possession, as the church could not tolerate spiritual authority that bypassed male clerical mediation. The regional variations in sin categories reveal the political rather than theological nature of these concepts. As different areas developed different emphases in their catalogues of manufactured transgressions based on local power structures and social tensions rather than consistent theological principles. Areas with strong merchant classes faced intensive preaching against commercial sins, while regions with powerful noble families heard elaborate condemnations of peasant aspirations for social advancement, demonstrating that sin categories were tailored to serve local political needs rather than universal spiritual truths. The Church's ability to adapt its sin categories to different social and political contexts reveals the calculated nature of these theological innovations, as genuine spiritual principles would presumably remain constant across different human communities rather than shifting to accommodate the interests of local elites. The contradiction between official doctrine and clerical behavior exposes the cynical nature of manufactured sins, as church leaders routinely engaged in behaviors they condemned as sinful when practiced by lay people, demonstrating that these concepts were tools of control rather than genuine moral principles. Bishops who accumulated vast wealth preached against avarice, priests who fathered children condemned sexual sin, and theologians who pursued extensive secular learning warned against the dangers of curiositas, revealing a double standard that served to maintain clerical privilege while restricting lay behavior. The Church's institutional practices directly contradicted many of the sins it preached against, accumulating wealth, exercising political power, engaging in warfare, and pursuing worldly knowledge. Yet these contradictions were explained away through elaborate theological justifications that exempted clerical behavior from the moral standards applied to ordinary believers. The evolution of confession practices reveals how manufactured sins were institutionalized through sacramental systems that required believers to regularly confess to transgressions they might not have realized they had committed, creating ongoing relationships of spiritual dependency that served church interests. The development of detailed confession manuals provided priests with extensive lists of potential sins to explore with confessants, including many manufactured categories that had no basis in traditional Christian teaching, but served to ensure that no believer could ever feel spiritually secure without regular clerical intervention. The requirement that believers confess sins they were not aware of committing created psychological frameworks where spiritual health required constant professional mediation, transforming salvation from a gift of divine grace into a service provided by ecclesiastical institutions in exchange for submission and payment. The impact on intellectual development of manufactured sins like curiositas demonstrates how theological innovations serve to retard human progress in fields that might challenge ecclesiastical authority, creating climates where scientific inquiry, philosophical investigation, and educational advancement were branded as spiritually dangerous rather than beneficial to human flourishing. Universities that developed during the medieval period faced constant tension between intellectual inquiry and theological orthodoxy, with scholars forced to navigate complex boundaries between acceptable and sinful forms of knowledge that were designed more to protect church authority than to promote genuine learning. The condemnation of curiositas as sin created intellectual climates where asking questions, conducting experiments, and pursuing knowledge beyond prescribed boundaries became acts of spiritual rebellion rather than natural human activities, retarding scientific and philosophical development for centuries, while ensuring that educational institutions remained under clerical control. The legacy of manufactured sins continues to influence religious and social thinking in ways that reveal the enduring power of these medieval innovations to shape human behavior and self-perception, as many concepts invented for political purposes during the medieval period continue to operate as psychological and social control mechanisms in contemporary contexts. Modern believers often struggle with feelings of guilt and spiritual inadequacy that trace directly to manufactured sin categories rather than authentic spiritual principles, demonstrating the lasting psychological damage created by theological innovations designed to serve institutional rather than human interests. The Church's success in embedding manufactured sins into popular consciousness created cultural frameworks that continue to influence social behavior, personal relationships, and individual self-worth in ways that serve institutional authority rather than human flourishing, revealing the enduring power of spiritual manipulation to shape human societies across centuries. As you contemplate these revelations about the systematic manufacture of sin for political and economic purposes, consider how many of your own feelings of guilt, inadequacy, and spiritual insecurity might trace to theological innovations designed not to promote human flourishing, but to ensure institutional control over human consciousness and behavior. The medieval church's campaign to transform normal human thoughts, feelings, and actions into occasions for guilt and dependency created psychological frameworks that continue to operate in contemporary religious and social contexts, shaping how people understand themselves, their relationships, and their place in the world. These manufactured sins were not theological accidents, but calculated instruments of social control that reveal the capacity of religious institutions to manipulate human psychology for political and economic advantage, transforming salvation from liberation into dependency and spiritual growth from freedom into submission. If this exploration into the dark machinery of theological manipulation has illuminated patterns of control that extend beyond medieval history into contemporary experience, share your insights. Subscribe for more investigations into the hidden mechanisms of institutional power, and remember that true spiritual growth requires distinguishing between authentic moral principles and manufactured categories designed to serve institutional interests rather than human flourishing. Would you have recognized the manufactured nature of these sins while living under medieval church authority? Or would you have internalized these concepts as genuine spiritual truths requiring constant confession and ecclesiastical mediation for your salvation?